My name is Sophia Hale. I am 38 years old. 12 days ago my brother called me and told me my husband was in surgery. The problem was my husband was sitting right next to me. That night felt so ordinary that I almost hate remembering it now. Daniel and I were on the couch halfway through a horror movie we had already seen twice. The lights were low. There was a bowl of popcorn between us. He had one arm stretched along the back of the couch behind me, the way he always did when he was relaxed enough to make fun of everything on the screen. He laughed at a scene that was supposed to be terrifying, and said they should have spent less money on the creature and more money on the script. I smiled without even looking at him. I knew exactly what face he was making. That was what marriage felt like after enough years. Not fireworks, not mystery, pattern, comfort, recognition. Then my phone rang. Ethan. I answered without thinking. Sophia. Get to St. Vincent now. Your husband is in surgery. I let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. That is impossible, I said. He is sitting next to me at home. I turned and looked at Daniel. He was holding a piece of popcorn halfway to his mouth, watching my face. There was a pause on the line. Not confusion, not panic, certainty. I am at the hospital, Ethan said. They just asked for you. The name is Daniel Hale. You need to get here now. Daniel straightened. What is going on? My brother says, you are in surgery. He frowned, held out his hand for the phone, and listened for a few seconds. Then he gave it back. Hospitals mix things up sometimes, he said. You should still go. Just check. He said it so calmly that for a second I almost felt embarrassed for how hard my heart had started pounding. I grabbed my coat and left. On the drive over, I kept trying to fix it in my head. Wrong patient, wrong name, someone else with the same last name, a clerk who typed too fast, a nurse who read the chart wrong. Any explanation that could keep the world in one piece. But Ethan did not sound like someone dealing with a misunderstanding. He sounded like someone standing in front of something real. When I got there, he was already waiting in the hallway outside surgery. His shoulders were tight, his jaw looked locked. He did not rush at me, he did not over-explain. He just put a hand on my arm and said, you need to stay steady before you see him. Before you see him. The doctor spoke in short, controlled sentences. Car accident. Significant blood loss. Surgery completed. Stable but not awake. I shook my head. No. That is not possible. My husband is at home. The doctor did not argue. He just opened the door, and I saw him, Daniel. Not someone who looked like him, not someone close enough to confuse me. My husband, the scar near his eyebrow, the shape of his hands, his wedding ring, his face, his body, the exact weight of him even while unconscious. He was lying there under hospital light, pale and motionless, with machines breathing around him. An hour earlier I had left my husband sitting on our couch. I stepped back. Then who had I left at home? If the man at home looked exactly like your husband, would you run back or stay and ask one more question? I stayed long enough to be sure I was not imagining any of it. Then I walked out to the parking lot and called home. He answered on the first ring. Hey, are you okay? His voice was warm, familiar, exactly the same. They say you are here, I said. There was a quiet exhale on the other end, almost like a sad little smile. You probably saw someone who looks like me, he said. You just went through a shock. Come home. We will figure it out in the morning. His tone was so steady that for one ugly second I questioned my own eyes. I went home. He was waiting. He stood up as soon as I walked in, pulled me into a hug, told me I was freezing, and made tea without asking whether I wanted any. He listened while I explained something that sounded more ridiculous every time I said it out loud. Everything about him was right. Too right. That night I lay beside him in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere across the city my husband lay in a hospital bed. And yet the man beside me breathed with the same rhythm Daniel always had. I told myself to sleep. I did not. When Daniel slept, he always shifted once before settling flat on his back. This man did too. Daniel always reached for me at some point in the night, absent-mindedly, like muscle memory. This man did too. But there was one difference. Daniel usually touched me before he was fully asleep. It was instinct, automatic. This man waited half a beat too long. Then his hand came to rest on my waist. It was such a small thing that I hated myself for noticing it. The next morning, I went back to the hospital. Daniel was still there. Still unconscious. Still undeniably real. I stopped telling anyone how confused I felt, because every version of it sounded like the kind of story people tell right before someone starts speaking to them softly and asks whether they have been under stress lately. At home, life continued. Dinner, coffee, quiet conversation, a marriage going through its normal shape. On the third day, I tested him for the first time without admitting to myself that was what I was doing. I brought up a weekend Daniel and I had spent on the coast years earlier. He remembered the hotel, the weather, the restaurant, the broken lamp in the room. Then I reminded him we had fought that night. His answer came a second too polished. We made up pretty quickly after that, he said. No, we had not. We had gone to bed angry, We barely spoke the next morning. That memory was not smooth. It had corners. He gave me the cleaned version, the version someone would repeat after hearing the story enough times, not after living through it. I said nothing. That evening I moved my ring from the tray by the sink to the edge of the counter. When he came into the kitchen, his hand went first to the tray. Then he stopped, looked once to the side and picked it up from the counter. Not searching, correcting. That was worse. The day after that I tested something else. I mentioned a tiny detail from an old dinner with friends, then changed the ending on purpose. Daniel would have corrected me without even thinking. This man nodded and followed my lie all the way through. He knew the shape of our life. He did not live inside it. On the 5th day, I watched him in the kitchen making coffee. Daniel always reached for the mugs without looking. This man got the right mug, but his eyes touched the shelf for a fraction of a second first, as though a blueprint in his head needed confirming before his hand moved. He was never far enough off to expose himself. He was only ever slightly late to being right. That pattern terrified me more than a mistake would have. By the 6th day, I tried to force myself back into sanity. I did not go to the hospital. I stayed home. I cleaned a closet. I answered emails. I folded laundry. I told myself I was overreading every gesture because trauma had cracked something in my head. That evening he was kind in a way Daniel rarely had time to be. He noticed I was quiet. He asked whether I had eaten. He sat with me longer than Daniel usually would have after a long day. He listened without rushing me. He looked at me with a kind of patient attention that made guilt rise in my throat. For one dangerous stretch of time I thought maybe I was doing something terrible. Maybe grief had arrived early and sideways. Maybe I had been married so long to a man who was often tired, distracted, overworked, that I no longer trusted my memory of tenderness when it finally appeared in front of me. That was the worst part. Not that I was afraid of him. That I almost believed him. Then, while we were cleaning up dinner, he said the thing that turned my stomach cold again. After what happened the other night, we should probably get our paperwork in order. I looked at him. What paperwork? Medical decisions. Financial stuff. If something like that happens again, you should not have to handle everything alone. It sounded responsible, mature, protective. It sounded like a husband who had just watched his wife get rattled by the idea of losing him. The next morning an email came through from our lawyer's office. Scheduled review, documentation updates, pending authorizations that might need to be aligned before the end of the week. I stared at the screen until the words stopped looking like words and started looking like a mechanism. This was not a random idea. This was not something he had just invented over dinner. This review had already existed. He had simply stepped into its path. That night I tested him again. I mentioned a mutual friend and the story of a ruined anniversary dinner, but I changed one name in the middle on purpose. He never caught it. He glided over it and gave me the emotional outline instead. Right shape. Wrong texture. Then he reached for my hand. Daniel always rubbed his thumb over the inside of my wrist before lacing his fingers through mine. It was such a strange, intimate habit that I had never told anyone about it. This man took my hand exactly the way Daniel would have, but the thumb came a second later, like a final remembered step. I felt the blood leave my face. When someone knows your marriage that well, do you trust your eyes or your memory? If you like smart revenge stories where the truth hides in plain sight, subscribe and stay with me. By the 8th day, I could no longer pretend I was just frightened. Ethan called and told me not to say where I was going. We met in a small office near the hospital. He had a tablet, a stack of printouts, and the kind of expression people get when they are trying not to say something too soon. He did not start with theories. He started with proof, admission records, timestamps, security camera stills from the hallway, nurse confirmations, everything aligned. The man in that hospital bed was Daniel. There was no room left for mistake. Then Ethan showed me a pattern, travel gaps, payments that did not fit, a movement trail orbiting the week of the accident before slipping backward into earlier months. I stared at it until a name rose in my mouth before I wanted it to. Victor. Daniel's best friend. The second I said it, everything I had pushed aside began crawling back at me in order. Victor lingering in our kitchen after Daniel had gone upstairs. Victor asking once too casually whether Daniel still handled most of our legal meetings himself, or whether I ever went in his place. Victor standing in the hallway looking at our wedding photo long enough for me to joke that he looked like he was studying it. At the time, each thing had been nothing. Together they felt like mold spreading under paint. Ethan turned the tablet toward me. A private clinic. Victor walking in with a cap and mask. Then later without the mask. Then later still swollen, bandaged, healing. Another visit. Another procedure. Another recovery. Not one miraculous transformation. A constructed one. He kept going back, Ethan said. I followed the money first. Then I got help. This is not me guessing. There were images of consultations, payment records, travel logs, enough to show a deliberate process, not a desperate impulse. And then came the part that changed the story again. My company, my property records, my trust. Victor had notes, references, Repeated mentions of review windows, signature alignment access conditions. He knew what I owned. He knew what Daniel could touch. He did not just want to be near me. He wanted the authority that came with standing where my husband stood. He did not just want Daniel's face. He wanted Daniel's legal life. Ethan showed me one marked section of the upcoming review. If Daniel were considered temporarily unable to act, certain layers of temporary financial authority could be activated. Not everything, not permanently, but enough to sign, move, approve, and open the next door. Not a robbery, a foothold. That was what the paperwork really was. A foothold. I thought again about calling the police that first night, but back then all I had was an impossible story, and a man at home who knew my life too well. If I had moved too early, he could have vanished, or stayed and made me sound insane. Now for the first time the picture was not just terrifying, it was coherent. I cried in Ethan's office for less than a minute, then I stopped. I am not confronting him yet, I said. Ethan nodded immediately. He had already reached the same conclusion. If you confront him, he said, he runs. I went home that night and sat across from the man wearing my husband's face. He looked up from the table and smiled in that familiar way. How was your day? Normal, I said. We ate in silence for a while. Then I set my fork down and looked at him. Maybe you were right about the paperwork. He did not react immediately. That was the first time I saw the calculation beneath the calm. Only if you want that, he said. I let my shoulders drop like I was tired of all of it. Tired of thinking. Tired of uncertainty. Maybe I am tired of not having anything feel stable, I said. Maybe I just want everything simple. That was the version of me he needed. Soft. Exhausted. Ready to hand decision-making to the nearest steady man in the room. The next day I asked for the documents myself. He did not need to push anymore. I did it for him. That made him safer with me, more relaxed, more certain. It also let me read every line with Ethan, and a lawyer who knew exactly what to look for. The language was polite, clinical, protective. But once it was translated into normal speech, the threat was clear. Temporary authority in the event of incapacity risk, signature alignment for pending approvals, trust-related acknowledgement in support of continuity. It sounded like order. It meant access. Victor was racing a window. One pending authorization and one trust review were already moving. If this paperwork went through while Daniel was out of reach and I believed the wrong man was my husband, Victor would not own my life in one step. He would do something worse. He would enter it legally. By the 11th day he began pushing without appearing to push. No reason to let this drag, he said one evening. It will just make things harder for you. For me. Always for me. That was another lie. He was not trying to reduce my burden. He was trying to beat a clock. Behind the scenes, Ethan and I did the opposite. Existing authorities were locked down. Verification layers were added. Evidence was passed to investigators. Our lawyer knew enough to keep the meeting alive but controlled. Nobody in that room would be guessing when the time came. If the man beside you wanted your name, your home, and your life, would you expose him now, or let him reach for the pen first? On the 12th day, we sat down in the conference room. The documents were arranged neatly in front of us, medical proxy updates, temporary financial authority, trust acknowledgements, all the little pieces of a bridge he thought would carry him into my life. He sat close enough that I could smell Daniel's cologne on him. That almost made me sick. This will make things easier for you, he said quietly. You should not have to carry everything alone. I picked up the pen, turned one page, then another. I let the silence stretch until I could feel his confidence settle around us like a second suit. You do not have to be afraid of this, he said. I am here. That was the last line he ever spoke to me as my husband. I set the pen down. Before I sign anything, I said I want everyone in this room to see who has been living in my house. The screen behind us turned on. Victor before, Victor during, Victor after, the clinic, the procedures, the pattern. The overlap between Daniel's hospital admission and Victor taking his place in my home. He went still. This is a misunderstanding, he said too fast. This is not real. I did not look at him. The man calling himself my husband is Victor Dane, I said, and this paperwork is not about protecting me. It is about giving him temporary authority he should never have had a chance to touch. I turned one of the pages in front of me and put my finger on the section Ethan had already walked me through. This is where he gets a foothold, I said. This is where concern becomes control. One of the people across the table went pale. If this had gone through, she said quietly, he would have had access. That was the real collapse. Not just that he was Victor, but that everyone in the room finally understood what he had been trying to become. The door opened. Investigators stepped inside. Not because of the signature, because the evidence had already been delivered, and the meeting gave them the cleanest place to end it. He stood up too fast and knocked his chair back. For the first time, he looked wrong in Daniel's body. Too sharp, too cornered, too much like a man whose face had run out before his options did. They did not call him Daniel, they called him Victor. Weeks later, the charges were clear. Identity fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, financial manipulation. What he built collapsed the moment his real name came back. When I returned to the hospital, Daniel was awake. His hand moved when I touched it. That was enough. After 12 days of living beside someone who knew my life almost as well as I did, I finally knew what was real again. The most terrifying part was not that someone had taken my husband's place. It was how close I came to believing him. If you like smart revenge stories where the truth hits harder than fear, subscribe and stay with me for the next one.